All right, so for those of you joining us early for this first session of Ask Me Anything with the Society Rapier Marshal, I'm Rosie. Cameraman today is my fantastic 17-year-old son, Marcus, and he's in the background right now, also helping his father look for the mask punch test, which I think I will use in the next video when we talk about armor testing and mask testing. I think we're going to touch on that today because there were a couple of questions asked about that already. But I'll do a close-up demo next time. So I'm sitting here in my barn dojo with my fantastic print that we got at the Higgins Armory. Thank you very much, Fergus, again. When the Higgins Armory unfortunately closed their doors as a museum. I've got the questions that were asked ahead of time with a few notes scribbled in that we'll discuss in just a few minutes. My water bottle from Artemisia. Thank you, Artemisia. I mean, I did pay for this. I think it was a fundraiser that they were doing. But every time I visit a kingdom, I try to buy something that's a memento of the kingdom. And ironically, most times when I go, it ends up being something that's a little bit mundane. I have a fantastic t-shirt that I wear as my travel pajamas, or at least the top, from Eldemir. And this metal water bottle from Artemisia is just about the right size to throw in my hiking backpack. I've got my cut and thrust helm here. I've got my gauntlets. Yep, these are actually the gauntlets I use. I did buy them off of the Headviewless Spider. Thank you very much, Benjamin. And I've got a few swords that I think will help answer some of the questions. So the way this is going to run is I'm going to start with these questions that were preceded on the form. Thank you very much, all of you who already asked some questions. And as I wind down the answer, I'm going to check in with my son, who is at the laptop and watching the live stream and watching your comments come in to see if there were any comments that were asked on the questions. Now, there is about a 20-second delay between me doing anything and you folks actually getting to see it. So I'll try to slow down at the end of an answer so that hopefully the questions can roll in. But if a question rolls by and we don't address it, or if it's on a different topic that we don't have time for today, well, we will address that next time, which honestly may be in a week, given the number and quality of questions that we have. All right. Maestro, is it 5 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time? It is. Then we might as well start. And you're good with the comments?
Yep.
All right. So I'm going to answer the very, very first question that was asked first because kudos to this person for being the first person to write it in. And that was, what do you foresee Rapier Spear becoming in the next 5 years? Okay, that's a great question. And I can't see the future, but let's sort of think back to, gosh, even 20 years ago when heavy rapier started to come in. That was sort of a more seismic shift, I'll grant you that. Yeah, we've sort of had these shifts, perhaps not quite as dramatically, over the years in SCA fencing. You know, when we had cut and thrust, side sword come in, and then perhaps more recently and more sort of to the point to spears, perhaps is when two-handers came in and became popular. And I do add that caveat because, to be honest with you, I started playing with what we then called a hand-and-a-half sword way back when we were still playing with epées. So I kind of personally liked the form. I don't think I was ever particularly great at it, but I did enjoy it. All right, so, but based on those, people are going to pick up spear. Some people are going to love it. Some people will, not want to give it any time of day. And some people are going to use it in melee and discover the tactical advantages that can be had by having a few spear people out on the field. And so I think that's where it's going to go. I think in 5 years, a lot of the brouhaha will have wound down, and people will have at least come around to acknowledging that spears can largely be used very safely Keep in mind, I was one of the skeptics, all right? When the experiment was first proposed, I thought that they were going to just hit too hard and that there was no way we could even run an experiment safely. So given like my personal experience, if I came around very quickly to the fact that these things can be used safely, I think that most people are going to recognize that. Some people probably grudgingly, but there's hopefully no arguing with data. And I think that in every large melee, there will be a few people who want to use spears. And as long as the marshal in charge allows them, because any melee, any tournament can be run with a subset of the rules. You don't have to have every weapon form allowed on the field. But for the melees that allow spears, I think there will be a large handful or two of spear fighters on the field. And I think they're just going to become just another weapon in our arsenal to play with, to have fun with, to do proper recreation of period melee. If you would like me to talk about period melee and the use of spears in them, I'd be happy to do that. It is a topic that I can probably drone on for half an hour about. All right, next question. There were a couple of questions asked about archery, specifically archery, in the projectile weapons part of the rules. And kind of rightly so. That section of our rules has expanded quite a bit from what we had before. Honestly, what we had before, I could very realistically characterize as projectile weapons are allowed, just do it safely. And to be honest with you, one of the reasons why I looked to expand that section of the rules was to get more people playing with them. Give them, their rightful prominence in our rules, get people thinking about, oh, what kind of weapon can I use that is a projectile that recreates something, period, that can be done so safely. And so that's actually one of the impeti for expanding that rule section. The questions specifically were asked in relation to experiments that were starting up in, I believe, Atenveldt and Anstiora. I apologize. I can't put my finger right now on exactly which kingdoms were starting to run those experiments. I did follow up with one of the persons who wrote that question, and they were kind enough to actually send me the experimental rules. And I read through those rules. They were using essentially archery tag weapons, archery tag arrows with these sort of fairly giant foamy blunts on the end. The arrow shafts were made out of fiberglass in those experiments. And with one exception, and that is the poundage of the bow allowed, I didn't actually see anything in the archery tag equipment that would not allow them to be used under our current rules. The 30 pounds versus 20 pounds, one of the people did also point that out and asked if we could run an experiment with that. Honestly, I am all ears. I'm happy to consider a subset of the experiment run to include a 30-pound draw on bows rather than a 20-pound draw on bows. I'm a little skeptical because they can be painful. I don't think that it's a huge injury risk, but given that, I don't think it's a huge injury risk, but potentially for bruising, we can certainly discuss it. I did also note that in the experiment that was proposed or run, in the experiment rule set that was sent to me, there was also a minimum distance allowed. So yes, your bow could draw up to 30 pounds, but you weren't allowed to shoot it within, I believe it was 10 feet of your opponent. And that was actually one of the reasons why I wanted to limit the draw to only 20 pounds, is because we don't have an associated distance. So I'm absolutely willing to listen to an experiment being run. It is entirely possible. We could even say, we could have perimeter bows that have a certain poundage and field bows that have a certain different poundage. I don't think that would be too difficult to include in our rules. We could color them differently with a tape or a flag or something like that. I think we're all pretty smart enough to allow for that sort of deviation, that sort of delineation in the types of weapons that are used. So there you go. My short answer is, barring the poundage, I didn't see anything in archery tag rules that would preclude that weaponry being used under the current society rules, and I'm happy to consider an experiment to increase the poundage from 20 pounds to 30 pounds. All right, I purposely did that summary there at the end to see if there are any questions or comments specifically related to that, and I'm seeing him shake his head no, so let's move on to the next question. All right, this one I'm going to try to read verbatim. During a cut and thrust bout, two-handed sword fighters must wear rigid hand protection, and when two single-handed sword fighters with open guards face off, they can wear padded gloves. Why is it when a two-handed sword fighter faces off with a single-handed sword fighter, the two-handed sword fighter has to wear rigid protection when they are exposed to the same risk as the two single-handed sword fighters? All right, that's actually a really good question. The reason why someone facing against a two-handed sword needs to have additional protection is because the end of a two-handed sword moves very fast. It actually laterally moves the fastest of all of our metal weapons. And very easily actually ends up moving faster even than a spear, largely because a spear is used as a thrusting weapon. The question is valid in terms of, I'm holding a two-handed sword, but the person I'm facing doesn't have a two-handed sword. So my fingers aren't at the same risk as if I'm facing someone wielding a two-handed sword. And so I really appreciate that question. I will follow up with you in person, but I'm actually willing to consider a variance in that type of case, that it depends who you're facing. Other things that we do have to consider is the person holding that single-handed sword now does have to make sure that their hands are protected against that two-handed weapon. Does that slow them down, therefore giving you some sort of unfair advantage? So there's sort of those things to consider. But first and foremost, our rules, our martial art, are about safety. And I want to make sure that we're doing that in a logical way. All right. Next question. This is also related to the additional hand protection needed for cut and thrust. All right. So in this question, what they state is the following. People agree with me that finger protection is overly protective to the point that using required finger hand protection is impeding proper hand and wrist technique. And I do finish that with, can we have an experiment on using less hand protection? I'm going to answer that last part first. Can we have an experiment on using less hand protection? Honestly, the facetious answer is, well, sure, that's what we did. We've run that experiment for the last 20 years. But that's a facetious answer. And in reality, the following is true. We increased the hand protection because we were seeing some bad hand injuries. And honestly, in today's day and age, most of us really need our hands to do our jobs, be it because you are in a manual field where you absolutely, by definition, use your hands, or even those of us who spend most of our days sitting behind a computer. We need our hands to type. Sure, there's speech to voice and to text and all that. But hand injuries are concerning, and we were seeing hand injuries. So I'm loath to go back, to even consider going back all the way to just having a plain leather, or even honestly just abrasion-resistant glove, which is what our rules are about. But if there's something in between that we've overlooked, I'm absolutely willing to hear that out, okay? But now back to, are they overly protective? I do want to spend a couple of minutes on that rule, specifically what is that rule? Because I do think that some people have misunderstood the rule and are interpreting it even more broadly than it was meant to. So the rule for the hand protection, for the padded, for regular cut and thrust, or for rigid, for two-handed swords, is there to protect against the percussive hit. So what I mean by that is the following, right? So this is just an open type guard. This is a big sword. All right. So in this case, what is a reasonable percussive hit that can come and hit my hand here? So this is a reasonable type hit. I could sort of kind of squeeze this in there and get something, but I'm not going to get a bone in this position. So in this case, a lot of my hand is protected by that basket. The lower part of my hand, that is not quite as protected. It depends how I hold my sword. So when you go to get inspected, hold your sword and show it to the marshal, because there's a lot that even this knuckle bow protects against, right? So this type of hit will protect that knuckle underneath. Now, do I want to protect my knuckle? Yes. Yes, we do. Do consider yourself as, precious and important, right? So anyways, the point is, under something like this, I don't have to wear my full rigid, because there's a lot of my hand that is already protected against percussive hits, against reasonable percussive hits, just because of that basket. By the way, these are my gauntlets, right? Oh, I think I said that already, that I do wear. And my job, is sitting behind a computer. Now, I do also enjoy other things like sword fighting and metalworking that use my hands, but I would rather have extra protection on my hands, because it sucks when your hands hurt. All right, any other questions related to cut and thrust hand protection that have come in, Maestro? He's shaking his head no. Okay, this was a quick question with a quick answer. Are there plans to adjust the phase out of the metal spears now that, unfortunately, the phase out is on December 31st of this year, which is still when most of the world is under COVID lockdown, especially the parts of the world where there is the most activity in those spears. All right, the phase out of the metal spears had been put in for the end of this calendar year, so that you folks who enjoy those spears can continue to do so through the major summer season. It also gives you time to ramp up with the new rubber spears. So absolutely, thank you for bringing this up to my attention, because I am human and it may have slipped my mind. I will talk to our Society Marshal to extend that so that you get the sort of intent of that ruling, so that you can play with them through a full season while you ramp up with the rubber spears. Okay. All right, next question was about the armor. So I'm going to read you the question verbatim, and then we'll discuss the answer to it. And the question is the following. Someone pointed out to me that SCA Rapier Handbook states puncture-resistant armor must meet the 550 newtons requirement, while commercially produced masks are more like 350 newtons. Is there a reason for that, etc.? All right, let me explain a little bit about commercial armor used in FIE fencing. I'm going to break it up first into jackets and masks. And I know the question specifically was about masks, but the two are related. If you go to a modern fencing website, and I encourage you, for example, to look at the Léon Paul website. They're a British manufacturer. They make most of their stuff in England. I'm not here to endorse them or anything like that, but their website, they actually explain a bunch of things in their website, and they've got some really awesome videos on YouTube showing you how some of this stuff is made. So that part's really cool. And on their website, you can buy 350 Newton jackets and 800 Newton jackets. And they have a note specifically in there, which is so true that I'm going to try to quote it verbatim, but off the top of my head, which is something like, the fencer who practices 2 or more times a week or participates in any competition should really consider an 800 Newton jacket. In fact, the FIE, the International Federation of Fencing, the FIE requires 800 Newton jackets to be worn in competition. So yes, you can buy 350 Newton jackets, but it's not recommended, and those are definitely below our standard. Now, how does this relate to masks? Well, actually, most of the mask protection comes from the mesh, right? The mesh that covers the face and a little bit of the side of the head. There's also a bib that is made out of very similar, or sometimes identical material to the modern fencing jacket. And when you see 350 newtons, that's what they're referring to. They're referring to that bib. And given that under that bib, we're wearing armor and a gorget, that bib doesn't matter. You can go ahead and buy a mask with a 350 Newton bib, but it's the mask mesh that matters, and that's not measured in newtons. That's measured in kilograms. Specifically, how much weight, essentially, do you have to put, how much, like pounds force, do you have to put on the wires of the mesh by a cone that's a very specific size, I believe it's a 5-degree angle cone, in order to separate the mesh. And modern fencing masks meet the 12 kilogram requirement. As I mentioned, I do have one of those mask punch testers, and I will do another video specifically on armor testing and mask testing. But that's the point that I want to make in response to this question, which is when you see 350 Newton mask, it's really referring to the bib, and you can go ahead and buy that. But in terms of jackets, the 350 Newton jacket, which even for modern fencers, they acknowledge is only for very light use, beginner learning students, that's not good enough. Go ahead and buy the FIE jacket, which is 800 newtons. If you do buy a modern fencing jacket, do pay close attention to what the washing instructions are, please, 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 so that you maintain the level of protection that you get with that jacket when you buy it, all right? There was a related question to that, which was, why are we still using a punch test designed for foils and épées when we use rapier blades that don't break the same way? Okay, and that question is a little bit, you're missing a little bit actually of the history. We are not using a punch test designed for foils and épées. We are using a cross-section that in total surface area is similar to a broken foil. And way back in the Stone Age, when we were still making scrolls by carving them on rocks, that part's a little bit of a joke, we used the broken foil test. We would put like an archery blunt on the ground, take a broken foil and hit it 4 times of ever increasing strength. Boy, was there a lot of variation in that. We started looking at replacing that with something more repeatable. And I assure you that we had started using heavy rapiers by that point. But when you look at the way heavy rapiers can break, they absolutely can break with a point. Very, very commonly, what I've seen is that a break will start at a nick. So a blade has been hit enough times, it's got a burr and a nick, and that's where you start to propagate a break. And so when the break happens, you end up with a break with a sharp point right at the end. Sure, a lot of these heavy blades don't always break that way. Well, neither did foils and épées. I used to use sheet metal épées, in fact. They just folded over, okay? It is not a function of the shape that the metal is in, be it a rectangular cross-section because it's a foil, a V cross-section because it's an épée, or an oval cross-section because it's a schlager, or I don't even know, close to a figure 8 with some of these side sorts that I have. It is a function of the metal itself. And you can have a pocket of carbonization that's going to be very brittle and stick out like a point when the thing breaks, okay? So a heavier weapon can still break and be dangerous, just as a foil and épée could. And moreover, the test that we designed was designed this way for consistency. the cross-section that we used goes along with the weight of the test. If we use a bigger cross-section, we'd use a bigger weight or a greater height that it's dropped from. The test all goes together, and a lot of hours, many hours by people who dedicated themselves to this, and a lot of people who did, I want to say a lot of really smart people put their heads together. And the reason I'm not saying that is I was one of those people doing some of the work in the background. And I don't want to be here like, oh, patting myself on the back. But I do know intimately how that test came about. And honestly, it was a very impressive effort. And there are good reasons why that test is designed the way that it is. All right, can I get a time check, please?
It is 5:22.
5:22, we've only been at this for 22 minutes, good. Any other questions that have come in the comments?
Not so far.
All right, no comments at all?
We've gotten some hellos.
Okay, well, hello. I am seeing them sort of scroll up a little bit on my phone, but they're kind of too far away for me to read, and then they go away because I'm just watching it like you guys are watching it, including the 20-second delay, by the way. So if I do something super goofy here, I won't know it for another 20 seconds. All right, so I think I've addressed those questions that I had already highlighted for myself. All right, here's another question. With the updated rules, why does fighting with spears universally require a separate authorization process where the rules for authorizing with other weapons and defensive tools are allowed to vary from kingdom to kingdom? Good question. And the answer is because that's the way that the experiment had been run. I fully expect that as spears become more and more common and just another part of what we do, that we'll phase that out, and that kingdoms can decide for themselves how a spear authorization will be run, just like kingdoms decide for themselves how authorizations for all weapons forms are run. I mean, or maybe we could go the other way and start dictating exactly to every kingdom how every authorization should be run, but I don't think that that's very likely because we're not seeing a need for it, right? Once again, the marshalate, the rules are first and foremost about safety, which actually brings to mind another question. And this one had been asked actually in passing by an acquaintance, sort of related to the rules are about safety. And the question, since the question is not written down, I'm just going to sort of paraphrase it and lead into the answer. And that is, yeah, the rules are about safety, first and foremost. And they are about how can we recreate fencing from pre-1600 in a safe manner, right? Fencing for pre-1600, maybe it was a sport, but really a lot of the manuals are about how you kill the other person. Right, so it's deadly. It is meant to injure, to kill. It is meant for you to win and be definitive and be the one who walks off the field. What we're doing is a sport. We want to be able to go out and drink with our friends later. We don't want to injure each other, and so safety has to be first and foremost. But absolutely, it should be and is about how can we encompass more and more of what they did pre-1600, right? When we started decades ago, we didn't have these wonderful weapons that are such a good simulacrum of what's really out there. And so we played with what we had. We had foils and epées. We had fiberglass fishing poles that we taped together to kind of simulate a weapon. We did the best we can. And maybe 20 years from today, we will have something even better that we can't imagine now. Looking at these weapons, I mean, this weapon is pretty awesome and very representative, and it's well balanced and it's well made. And then, okay, I've got a bright yellow piece of tape and a tip on it because we need that for safety. And who knows, maybe 20 years from now, we'll have figured out how to have a force field on ourselves so that we don't need that and make the weapon even more realistic. But for now, this is what we have. And this is pretty darn good. the expansion to things like rubber-headed spears, and there was a question asked about why did we go to rubber-headed spears from the metal-headed spears. The evolution there is, once again, both about safety and about simulation. The spears or pikes, polearms that were used in period weren't wibbly wobbly like the metal spears are. I'll grant you that the metal spears being used, we don't have like huge injury reports or anything coming from them, but that may also be because of the limited use that they've seen. But in terms of it being a simulacrum of the actual weapons that were used, the rubber spears, the rubber-headed spears do a pretty good job, and actually they kind of do a better job than the metal spears. Once again, our rules are first and foremost about safety, but secondly, about how do we encompass more and more the way that this, what we now call a sport, was done in the pre-1600s. All right.
Before you move on,
Yeah.
May I ask a question?
There's a question.
How do rubber spears better emulate spear usage than metal ones do?
I don't know if y'all heard that. It was, how do rubber spears emulate real spears better than metal ones? That's a very legit question, because the original spears that were used in period were not rubber. They were, in fact, metal. But the heads were much more rigid. Right now, the way that we have implemented metal spears in SCA fencing is it's a 36-inch long blade that is put on a wooden shaft. The blade ends up being very wobbly. The rubber spears, the rubber spear heads, actually behave much more like the metal ones from period, because when you move them around, they don't wobble. When you go to thrust, the tip is largely where you expect it to be. Now there's probably a couple of you sitting there behind your keyboards thinking, but the rattan is wobbly, and I agree with you. I do. The reason why we went to rattan only first is because of the way that some woods break, right? Rattan is a grass. Things like pine, oak, yew, those are woods. And some of them will break very jagged in a very dangerous way. There are some woods that are better than others, but it is felt to not be reasonable to ask marshals on the field doing an inspection to know the difference between the different types of wood. Sometimes it's really difficult to judge. I myself have made some very embarrassing mistakes lately with some very, very old cedar that didn't have the color of cedar and didn't smell like cedar, and I didn't realize that it was cedar. While seeming beside the point, that really is the point. We want to make sure that marshals who are there to sort of oversee safety have the tools they need sort of very easily to verify that someone is within the rules. Another video that I do have in mind of making is a suggested marshal's kit. I don't expect marshals to go out there and have, say, a mask punch test, but you can verify a lot of things with simple tools like a few washers for weight, a measuring tape, perhaps a ruler. Sometimes a ruler is more useful than a measuring tape. Some pretty simple tools. Relatedly, there is a note in these rules where we purposely did remove some requirements sort of from the marshalate and put them right on the shoulders of the fencers themselves. So for example, when you go to inspect someone's armor, the marshal is encouraged to, the marshal is only required to only go so far as to ask them if they have rigid protection on all the areas that need to have rigid protection. And it is incumbent upon the fencer to have read the rules, understood them, and are abiding by them. All right. We don't need anyone to go inspect whether there is rigid protection on various bits and pieces of the body. We don't expect the marshal to know that this person has the type of birthmark on their upper arm that's going to bleed if it is cut. We expect the person to know. In fact, one of the questions that was asked of me when I put the rules out for comment was, well, like, what is this? This like red birthmark that bleeds? Like, well, the marshals can't be expected to know that. And I agree with that. I do. But I do expect that the fencer would know if they have that, and therefore would read that and say, oh, that's me right there. I should cover that up with rigid protection because that's what the rules say. Okay? So there's certainly some parts that we have removed from the shoulders of the marshal and put them right on the shoulders of the fencer themselves. But within reason, we want to make sure that the marshal can inspect weaponry to the rules without like having very, very specific knowledge that you wouldn't expect most people to have. All right. Any other questions that have come in? Thank you. Okay, 2 questions regarding rubber-headed spears. Right now, there is no minimum length, only a maximum. Is there any thought about addressing this by way of a rules update or marshalate guidance? Also a good question. There is no minimum, and a couple of people have asked me about whether they can have a really, really short one that's essentially a spear dagger. And the short answer is yes, you can have that. It's not disallowed. If you want to have a tiny little piece of rattan with a rubber-headed tip on it and only use it for thrusting, I don't know why you would, when you could have a dagger, an actual metal dagger that you can thrust and cut with. And this absolutely falls into that. Don't make me make a rule. All right. If people start using these recklessly, dangerously, then we're going to have to make a rule. And I'm not above making that rule. Other questions that have been asked about spears come down to, well, can I attach extra pieces of rattan to basically make like a spear trident? And that actually is specifically not allowed in the rules. Sometimes you do have to just understand the rules and what they mean. And this isn't, once again, spirit of the law versus letter of the law. By the way, if there's ever a doubt, spirit of the law, man, that's like really important. But in this case, it comes down to what can you do with that shaft or haft? You can shave it down. See the other video about how to do that, what the rules are about that. Put it in the rubber spear and decorate it with tape, ribbon, tassels, whatever. Have at it. You can put tape on the shaft to further decorate it, but that's it. Specifically, don't put metal studs on your shaft. How are you going to make it into a trident? You're going to need to attach things to it. Think about it. If that trident breaks off, what did you attach it with? Screws or even just wooden dowels? So short, rigid wooden dowels. Did you have to drill into that shaft? That's not allowed, right? So there's really no good way of making a trident. I bet you someone is out there thinking, if I can grow my own rattan and sort of slit it so that it grows into 3, then I get a single piece of rattan that has 3 heads. All right. That's not against the rules. I'd love to see it. The second part of that question was about grasping spear hafts. In Estiora, when they ran the experiment there, that was allowed, but it was not part of all the other kingdoms' experiments. And so it didn't migrate into the rules. Grabbing spear hafts goes along with grabbing anybody's weapon. Fleeting contact is allowed, but grabbing it is not allowed at the society rules. But it was being successfully run in Estiora. And so I'd be absolutely happy to consider an ongoing experiment that does allow that. That was going to be the next phase of the experimentation, actually, across all the kingdoms. But then the rules came in. Part 1 was so wonderfully successful in terms of the injury reports that, in other words, low injuries, that we adopted that straight into the society rules. But I'd be absolutely happy to have kingdoms continue to experiment with grabbing spear hafts and seeing if that continues to be safe, like we are starting to see the data come in from Instura. And then potentially we can include them in the rules. And that, I believe, is the sum total of the questions that I had prepared for today. There was a question about that 550 Newton garment punch test, but as I mentioned, I'm going to address that in a video dedicated to armor testing, both for the penetration-resistant armor and also for masks. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully I'll be doing that within the week. And if there are no other questions that my camera person has noted, then I'm going to sign off for now. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. Once again, my name is Rosie. My email address is rapier@sca.org. Feel free to drop me a note. Y'all can find me on Facebook as Rosie Galea. That's Galea. I've been absolutely loving being your Society Rapier Marshal, Deputy to the Society Marshal. I'm looking forward to working with our new Society Marshal as he ramps up his tenure. And I am really looking forward to visiting those last 3 kingdoms that I haven't had a chance to visit during my tenure, and getting to see these rules actually implemented through next year and thereafter. Even when I step down, y'all won't be rid of me. I'll still be part of the community. Relatedly to that, sometime when we ramp back up, I'm going to be looking for deputies and people interested in taking over. Hopefully you can be my deputy for several months before we start the interview process, etc. And eventually I will gladly step down from this job, but I'll continue having fun while doing it.